And with that, I also want to acknowledge that we are still in a very uncertain situation. We are all navigating this time of uncertainty and increasing complexity, and trying to find a new way forward. And that is a big part of what this series is about, navigating uncertainty, is being creative and trying to reimagine what our world can look like. That's what Royal Roads is here to promote, really, and here to support others in doing. And I also want to acknowledge that many of us at Royal Roads are working from home. All of us on this webinar today are working from home. So we're all coming in from our individual internet connections. So there may be a little bit more possibility for AV disruption. So if anything comes up on your end, let us know. But I will say right now, coming through the application is usually a better user experience for Adobe. If you've come through the HTML, sometimes there can be a little bit more disruption, but sometimes just closing, leaving the room and coming through a different browser can also be really helpful as well. And probably many of you are already familiar with Royal Roads, but I'm just going to give you a super brief overview of who we are before we get going. So we're based in Victoria, BC. We're a professional university. We were created 25 years ago. So we're actually also a National Historic Site. So there's an iconic structure on campus, Hatley Castle, but that's just one of many buildings. We have many newer structures on campus too for learning and innovation. We're also on a huge amount of natural land as well. We have Charlie's Trail, which is representative of 565 acres of old growth. And from the back of the castle, you can see Esquimalt Lagoon, which actually feeds into the ocean. So very beautiful place to explore. And we have been delivering online learning for 25 years. This is something that we're very proud of, especially in this time where so many institutions are transitioning to online. This is something that we've been perfecting for a long time. And we are here to explore design thinking for disrupted times. So I want to introduce Ross Porter, who's the assistant professor and program head for the Bachelor of Commerce program. Welcome, Ross.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
And I also want to introduce Tabea, who is the associate faculty within the School of Business. They'll be leading you through the presentation. I'm going to pop off in a minute, but I'm going to do a couple more introductions before I pass it over to Ross. So I'm Alana McConaughey. I'm an education advisor. I'll be on the back end for the rest of the webinar. We also have Tracy Summers, who's an enrollment advisor, and she'll be piping in as well if anybody has questions about any programs. And then I also have one of my colleagues on the call as well. I believe it is, yes, Lena Kunar is on the call. So lots of support here. And also I invite you all to type in where you're watching in from and what kind of work you're up to, because it'd be great for people to read through that as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ross.
Thanks very much, Alana. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Building on what Alana said, this is a series that started in response to COVID and increasingly other societal upheavals and the unprecedented impact it's having on all of us as individuals, as teams, as organizations, and broader society. To say that these are uncertain and disrupted times would be an understatement. And with that, each webinar that we're going to be engaged in through this series is designed to speak to an area of research and teaching and practice that we're engaged in at Royal Roads and feel could be of value to a wider audience, you. In the first webinar, we explored the value of entrepreneurialism. Many of you may have joined us a few weeks ago for that webinar. Arguably, the world has never been in more need of entrepreneurially minded individuals and teams and organizations than it is today. Indeed, it's imperative that every one of us re-examine what we do, why we do it, how we do it, and ask, is there a better way? A way that better serves the needs of others and done in a responsible and equitable way. In today's webinar, we're going to explore some of the theory and practice of design thinking. So where entrepreneurialism and design thinking intersect is in their focus and orientation to problem solving and value creation, to reimagining what's possible, building better solutions, be they products, services, or entire systems. And I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Tabea Berg. Tabea teaches in the area of strategy, marketing, and entrepreneurial management and within the BCom, and is actively engaged in the study and application of innovation and design thinking. Tabea, I'm really pleased that you're joining me today to share your insights and perspectives on design thinking, what it is, and how it can help us in these disrupted times. So our agenda is, Tabea is going to set, both of us are going to set a bit of the context, dive into what design thinking is and how it could be used for value creation. We'll also create some space at the end of the webinar for some questions and discussion. However, we'll be monitoring the chat box, and if you have questions and comments as we go through the webinar, we will do our best to address those. So with that, let's get started, Tabea.
So much everyone for joining today. I'm really delighted to be here, present with you virtually. So our VUCA world, and this stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think these dynamics or dimensions are not introduced into our world by COVID, but rather they've been brought into sharp focus. So the fact that things are changing rapidly, we don't know what the future holds. Arguably, our time horizons for planning are much shorter than they've ever been. Any decision that's made has far-reaching impacts because there are interconnected systems at play. And then, of course, the ambiguity of, okay, we're confronted with problem X, Y, or Z. What does this mean moving forward? So I think while before COVID we had kind of an illusion that life was somewhat predictable and controllable, what COVID has done is really highlight that this simply isn't the case. So closely associated with this is the notion of wicked problems, which actually has been in the literature since the 1970s, but again is really a contemporary discussion. So this is from Flood and Jackson from 1991. So this is a while ago, but still very relevant today. This idea of wicked problems. So most problems in organizations and elsewhere are wicked problems, but most problem-solving methods are suitable for simple, well-structured problems. The usual approaches do not, therefore, help organizations or people deal with their most important problems. So what we're realizing anew is that some of our traditional problem-solving methods simply are not sufficient to the more thorny and complicated problems that we're facing.
An increasing criticism of business and management education, not addressing the complexity of the problems that we face in business and beyond, and equipping students with ways of working through uncertainty and ambiguity with a degree of confidence and competence beyond the search of simple solutions to complex problems.
Yeah, and I think, for example, in business education, there's been a lot of reliance on case method, which is great, but I think what it does is sometimes give students a mistaken assumption that, okay, I've worked through this problem in a linear fashion, and now that's a template for problem solving moving forward. And we know that there are always contingencies and unexpected situations that arise, best laid plans kind of thing. So for every complex problem, sure, there's an answer that's clear, simple, that might seem obvious, but more often than not, it's wrong simply because it doesn't address the complexities that we're talking about today.
Well, I was reminded of how we're confronted, maybe not recently because we're not traveling through airports, but the typical example is an airport bookstore. But if you can think about whether it's online bookstores or physical bookstores, you walk into the business and management section and there's a plethora of tomes that are suggesting that they have the answer to the problems that we're seeking solutions for. And they're very appetizing and attractive because I think we're all searching for the silver bullet. And get disappointed when we realize that there isn't such one. There's multiple different approaches to addressing a problem, and they're not as simple as 5 or 6 steps or the principles of success as various authors would have us believe.
Yeah, that's true. And I think what's been interesting to me personally as a business person, a business educator, and just a human being in the world, it's been interesting to see how COVID in some ways has highlighted human resilience and forced us in some ways to be innovative and creative. And we see this with things like companies pivoting and designing ventilators and creating PPE and hand sanitizer and so on, and even our own rhythms at home. I know many of us have had to make adjustments because of the unexpected circumstances, and we find to varying degrees that we're actually able to do these things. So I think it's highlighting human resilience, but of course it's also bringing into sharp focus some of the systemic problems as well. So we've also seen a rise, in domestic violence and substance abuse issues and struggles with mental health. So it's been reminding us that these are still significant societal problems, alongside, of course, the uncertainty about where the economy is going to go moving forward. And then, of course, I guess not specifically catalyzed by COVID. Of course, we're seeing all of the social volatility, I guess, right now, sparked by events south of the border, and really raising these important questions of what kind of society do we want to live in, and what can we do about some of these more significant problems. And I think this is where some non-traditional creative problem-solving approaches can be useful for us. And I know last session in the series, in the webinar series, and I see that Rita's joining us here. So hi, Rita, and thanks for joining us. When she was talking about entrepreneurialism, it's this idea that entrepreneurs approach problems differently. So they will see a problem, but very quickly move to where's the opportunity in this. And so it's the idea of not ignoring the real issues, but how do you reframe that in a way that allows for possibility, that creates hope and optimism. And one of the syntactic stems that we use in design thinking to help us generate ideas is what you see on the screen there, this how might we question, because it invites hope and divergent thinking and many possibilities. And that's really a different approach to problem solving.
Both in organizational life as well as in the classroom, is people will often stop at the problem identification or the identification of the challenge, but not necessarily move themselves into reimagining how that problem or that challenge or that opportunity can be addressed. And so I think it's easier for us to point, but not actually to probe. And so that's why the reframing piece is absolutely critical, so that we can see things anew and from different perspectives and different angles, and see an opportunity where only others may see challenges, or see a different way where people only see one way.
Yeah, and so getting kind of more into the guts of the presentation and talking about design thinking more particularly, the reframing happens throughout the process. So as you get new and better information and operate on the basis of good research, but also intuition, if I can put it that way, you're constantly reframing the problem. And so as you're moving through the process, what you find is, more often than not, I don't want to say always, but more often than not, where you end up is sometimes a very different place than where you started, based on how your assumptions have been invalidated as you move through the process. So here you see on the screen a conceptualization of the process. And design thinking is a process, but I want to unpack that a little bit more as we move through the webinar, because this can be in some ways misleading. But I do want to kind of touch on these various phases so that you have an idea, if you're not familiar with design thinking, what each of them comprise. So in the empathize phase, and this is really the foundation of design thinking as a creative problem-solving approach, it's hugely user-focused. So whoever your client is, the constituents that you're designing a service for, you want to get at the deep-seated needs that are represented by their expressed wants. And this goes beyond what we might think of as traditional market research strategies. So for example, if you're designing a service, let's say you're a bank, and you're designing whether it's an in-person or an online service, ideally you want to get where you can observe people interacting with your service. So you can see facial expressions and what are the things that they're saying in process. Where are the bumps and the hurdles in their process? Because what you can observe in human behavior is more authentic even than what people will say they will or won't do in a certain situation, although that's valuable as well. So it's almost an anthropological approach to understanding human behavior. Once you have gathered as much research and that human-centered data as you can, then you kind of want to frame the problem. So given this and the insights that we have generated from this process, what do we understand about the problem now that we didn't before? What assumptions did we have that actually aren't true, or what's the more pressing issue that we have here to deal with? And then out of that problem reframing, you define the problem and use that how might we question as your frame to then move into ideation. So that's a fancy way of saying idea generation. And you want as much as possible to generate a high volume of diverse ideas. And yes, you do eventually bring those down and converge on one or a handful of ideas based on, what are the most important criteria that you want to adhere to as you're moving through the process. And then you very quickly move to prototyping. And when we talk about prototyping and design thinking, it's even earlier or more formative or crude even than a minimum viable product. So you're prototyping as soon as you can and generating these low fidelity, sometimes hand-drawn conceptions of your ideas, and then moving that as quickly as you can into testing, where you put that idea in prototype form in front of your intended end user and say, simply, what do you think of this? What do you see? What's your understanding of this? What would you do next? And in that, again, you get to invalidate or validate your assumptions moving into your prototype, but you also get some really good ideas that come out of that. So it's a very participatory process with we call it in design thinking end user, all the way through the process. That said, it's a mistake to think of this. Sure.
Sure. It goes back to stuff that Rita and I talked about in our last webinar. I think when people first hear the term empathy, they think of something kind of soft or loose, kind of a nice to have. And I think what people need to understand is that empathy, really seeking to understand, is hard work. This is not easy. It requires a level of purposefulness and dedication and deliberation. And so we might say it's nice to understand where other people are coming from, but in the context of design thinking, it's a very rigorous approach. As you said, it goes beyond traditional market research. It's really seeking to understand what the needs, wants, and expectations are. And you have to be open to have your assumptions challenged. And that's where often the deep insight is gained, is by holding your assumptions more loosely and have them challenged and to see things anew that previously you may have been blind to without even being aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were cutting in and out for me a little bit, but yeah, in a nutshell, I think you're speaking to the rigor of the process because, like you said, it can seem a little bit soft and fuzzy, but it's really about enhancing some of our more traditional, secondary research, the good primary research that is done in more, I want to say, I guess, traditional market research approaches, but it's a very holistic, like you said, how do we get the true or the most fulsome picture that we can? So this is, in the design thinking community, this is a diagram, this squiggle that many of us are familiar with, and we're familiar with it in process. Because while those hexagons are nice in that they give us those structural phases And while there are very concrete and helpful tools and techniques in design thinking, it's misleading to assume that it's just this set of tasks that you can go through. And I think that's maybe a common misconception with design thinking, that if you kind of go through the various steps, you've done it. But this squiggle is really more illustrative of what the process actually looks like. And in a way, those of us who are quite steeped in design thinking as an approach, what this process does that is almost freeing, I want to say, is that it normalizes ambiguity. So you know going in that the VUCA pieces, the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, the ambiguity is just part of the process. And that, I think, reduces some of the anxiety that some more traditional methods, and I'm thinking specifically of what students experience in the classroom, who may have been educated primarily using linear problem-solving methods. But while they experience some front-end discomfort, I'll say, with that process, very often once they've gone through it a few times, it really is liberating and freeing, which is a lot of fun to see. But yeah, definitely don't be fooled by the nice linear pattern of those hexagons. And I think even more important is, and this I know goes back to the entrepreneurial piece as well, it's less about the specific things you're doing and more the kind of composite mindset or the guiding principles that are informing what you do. And just to get into this a little bit more, it's interesting, in the design thinking literature, both academic and practitioner, there isn't a boilerplate agreed upon definition, but more this commonality of attributes in design thinking. So this is distilled from a very recent paper in the Journal of Product Innovation Management, where the researchers looked at a large cross-section of the academic and the practitioner literature over the past 10 years. They also went out and talked to people that work in design studios to try to come up with, what are the key and consistent identifying attributes of design thinking. And I've kind of, like I said, distilled it down. So empathy driven, we've already looked at that on a previous slide. So it's empathy for the end user, but also in terms of the whole process. So it's not just in that empathize phase, but it's constantly having the presence of mind that you're designing this for a real person in a real context who will experience the product or service or process that you're designing experientially. So they'll be bringing, and this moves into the next point, their whole selves to how they interface with your product, service, or whatever it is you're designing. That holistic piece, too, in design thinking speaks to the systems thinking aspect of the approach as well. So it's understanding that whatever solution you're designing will live in a context. So there are other stakeholders that are important to think about and consider as you're working on your solution. That again moves into this next point of inclusivity. So it's that systems-oriented thinking, recognizing that there's always a ripple effect, a knock-on effect to anything that you are designing. But also, what I want to highlight here is in the design thinking process itself, and in organizations that practice design thinking, the teams that they have working on the designs are cross-functional teams. There's a lot in the research that says the more diversity and other dimensions that you have on your team, the more, I guess, diverse ideas and plurality of insights that you'll have in the process, which I think is really instructive for us at this time specifically, that there's all kinds of insights available when you're connecting with people who are different than you and don't think like you. The idea of emergence, so it's a very iterative process. Things kind of come into sharp focus as you are moving through the process and you don't know where you're going to end up when you start. And again, it's having a certain comfort level with that process. And then finally, the visual and the tactile element of it. And this really is an important nod to the design origins in design thinking, where you're thinking about the elegance of the solution that you're bringing forward, but also there's all kinds of visualization in the process as you're moving along. So lots of visual tools. You're drawing things as you go. We use Post-it notes, whether those are physical or virtual. So yeah, really, really important to remember that it's a very action-oriented process. So you're trying to visualize as you're moving along, what is it actually that we're trying to design here?
And what do you find that when you've worked with, whether it be students or folks in organizations, is there certain attributes that folks struggle more with? Takes more time to kind of embrace and work through?
I think it's the discomfort with the early stages. So if I go back to this slide, the front end, and it's often referred to as the fuzzy front end of innovation. So once we get to, we've prototyped and we've iteratively tested various prototypes and we feel pretty good about where we've landed, the implementation part is actually fairly straightforward and more linear. But the front end of the process, where we don't know what we don't know, I think is challenging for some people. And it's a beautiful picture of what we're experiencing with COVID right now. But I think we found that push comes to shove, that ambiguity is something we are actually able to be resilient in. So I would say that's the biggest thing. And to, as a facilitator, be constantly coaching that what you're experiencing is normal. Once people have gone through a design thinking process a number of times, that kind of inner dissonance reduces, and that part of the process is embraced, because in effect, that's where the magic happens, where you're holding things very loosely and you do allow the process or ideas to emerge in process.
I can see a stumbling block being at the beginning if one isn't as open as they like to think they are to really understanding the user. It becomes seeking to validate your own assumptions and almost trying to sell the solution rather than really listening and then designing something that actually is much more, has greater affinity to the end user.
Yes, yeah, and that's a good point. I think that would be the second thing that comes up most often is a rush to solutions. And I think that's inherent in us. We want to solve the problem, right? And that's a good thing. But do we want to come up with the earliest available feasible solution? Or do we want to come up with something that's actually creative, more holistic, that really addresses what are the deep-seated needs that are happening? So moving along, just to come back to your point, Ross, about rigor, each design thinking project will have its own set of guiding criteria and principles. So what are the things this design has to do? But within design thinking, while if you're not really familiar with it, it can seem a bit abstract, does have very rigorous guiding criteria. So that desirability piece that you see at the top there is about the end user. Are we creating something that is desirable beyond the point of what the client or the end user says they want, but will actually delight them? The feasibility piece is, do we as an organization have the resources, the technology, the skill set, the knowledge to actually deliver on this solution and see it through? And then, of course, viability is about the business model. So is this going to be financially sustainable? Is this something that, if we test it, that we can scale, that we can support moving forward? Is the design itself resilient in terms of, it's something that can be iterated on moving forward?
I think that feasibility piece is very important. Having been involved in a lot of strategy conversations, often not enough time and consideration is given to do we have the capacity and capability to execute on the bright ideas that we're coming up with? And if not, are we prepared to go back and design something that actually is doable for us?
Yeah, and I think along with that is going back to the principle of inclusivity and partnering with people maybe that you wouldn't partner with. Because other organizations or team members may have resources that you don't, or skill sets that you can bring to the table.
I think that's a really important piece, especially in today. You talked about wicked problems. Wicked problems often are outside the scope of any one individual team or organization to be able to address. And so looking beyond the borders of our typical working environment and look for those collaborative opportunities becomes critical. Think of the things that we're facing as a society today. These are not going to be solutions to which are going to be developed in isolation.
No, absolutely. And I'll touch on a recent report that came out speaking to just that in a little bit. So, who's doing design thinking? These are some more well-known users, and this includes companies that will consult in design thinking, as well as companies that use a design thinking approach in-house for their product or service design. Interesting, I wanted to put a little bit of a nod to one of our VCOM Royal Roads alums. So Bridgeable at the bottom may not be familiar to some of you, but that is a service design company that was started by Chris Ferguson, again, one of our own. And he's done amazing award-winning work. He's become internationally known. And so that's at a service design company in Toronto. So shout out to you, Chris. So how does this show up in the classroom? I know it's, challenging to wrap one's brain around this at the conceptual level. So how are we actually applying this in the classroom and moving, maybe more important to some of you on the webinar today, how can you apply this to your own context? So where this shows up at Royal Roads is in a number of different programs and classroom settings, but speaking from my own experience, in our most recent offering of the marketing course in the BCom program, we had a live client, so a small business owner in the community who was looking for some marketing strategies. And what the design thinking process allowed the students in their teams to do, was go into the community alongside their survey-based market research, secondary source research into the local community and what's going on in the macro environment, to actually engage with current and potential customers and get deeper insights into what was actually going on in this small business. And one of the key insights that emerged was that the demographic that was most interested in this small business owner's products was in a different age group than she had previously realized. So that was, one important insight that came out of that. And you can see on the screen here, you can see students engaged in the process, some of the tools, so the feedback grid that we use for user testing, and then the journey map at the bottom where you're walking through how a client or end user engages with the product to help illustrate in an empathic way where are they experiencing friction in an interaction. And then the Royal Roads Design Thinking Challenge, we just had our third year, and it was very interesting this year because originally we were going to be physically together in Toronto. It was a co-hosted challenge between Royal Roads and Rotman out in Toronto, but COVID hit mid-process. So we had one phase that was done online, and then the second phase that was supposed to be where we gathered together physically, obviously that wasn't going to happen. So it was very interesting to see design thinking principles applied in real time, and the challenge organizers pivoted. We moved to the online platform, and it was a really successful experience. So, it was a lot of fun to see the students working on the social innovation challenge that they were using design thinking for, but also to experience that that real-time emergence and see that it actually works.
Earlier about we both commented about traditional style business and management education. So this is around our third year of incorporating design thinking as kind of almost an intellectual backbone or practice area across the program. As we've moved away from more traditional case-based analysis and equipping students into that, and then drawing them more into the design thinking space. And I think there's been a lot to learning for us and for you and Rita and others who engage in design thinking practices in the classroom. There's lots that we're learning about how to equip others into a design thinking mindset and approach.
Well, and I can tell you as a facilitator, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, every class that gets delivered is a prototype. So you're always trying new things, and so we're living design thinking in the classroom. And honestly, and to be authentic to the process, it means that sometimes what I had planned, say for week 4, is going to change slightly because the project has moved in a different direction. So I know using this approach in facilitating student learning has made me a little bit more resilient and have to pivot quite quickly. So where do we go from here? So how does this apply to you in your organization or to you personally? Because I think there are a lot of key principles that we can apply to our approach to life. However, Ross, I see in the chat window there a question that maybe
I do know that there are other people utilizing design thinking approaches in various courses in other programs. I think that BCom is somewhat unique in the sense that we've really embedded design thinking increasingly throughout the entire curricula. So we have a number of applied business challenges scattered throughout the curriculum. Those are all now design thinking based. We also have incorporated design thinking into our marketing courses. Tabea is doing it in the strategy courses. Rita does it in her entrepreneurship courses. So it's making its way, its tentacles throughout the entire program, because we see entrepreneurial practice and design thinking practice as kinfolk. They're deeply related to one another, and they both serve each other's mutual purpose, which is value creation. So there are other courses and programs that build on design thinking, but I think we're somewhat unique in the sense of inculcating it throughout the entire curricula, increasingly so. Exactly.
And I see that Rita's just jumped onto the chat there to mention some courses in which we've embedded design thinking,
so
and
that
then
was
applied
a pivot
business
we
challenges.
made 3 years ago when we said that we could be doing business education differently in the context of the BCom to really honor that entrepreneurial spirit. And we said traditional case-based analysis isn't as akin to supporting kind of an entrepreneurial mindset as design thinking is. I was fortunate enough to have Rita and others who were keen on design thinking. Michael Party, who will be joining me in the subsequent webinar on the changing landscape of work, is deeply involved in this as well. And Tabea, and we've been fortunate to, over a 2-year, 3-year process, really start to reshape what we teach and how we teach it.
Yes, it's been fun for me, I have to say. Awesome. Okay. So without knowing kind of where you're coming from or your level of familiarity with design thinking, I recognize that it might not be possible for you to turnkey go from this webinar and apply the full suite of design thinking practice in your organization. However, again, if we bring it to this idea of principles and we think about empowerment, because I'm finding that when I think about my own experience of COVID or my own experience of some of the social issues, I keep coming back to this theme of empowerment in situations that can feel, frankly, quite disempowering. So this idea of embracing VUCA, that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, if we could kind of reframe our thinking or our mindset and think in terms of, okay, this is the world that we live in, and it has been brought into sharp focus now more than ever. What are the ways that we as an organization, or myself in my career, or maybe even my personal life, how can I actually lean into this and see it as raw material for innovation and creativity? So in other words, where are the opportunities that are inherent in these challenging circumstances? I think empathy now more than ever is important for us all to consider. So we see organizations revisiting things like work from home policies and what do you do in a situation where you've got people who are working from home and they've also got family members there and so on. So COVID has catalyzed a lot of those more empathic conversations about how we collaborate and engage with each other from a human resource management perspective. So this goes beyond just embracing empathy from a business to consumer perspective. And then we've already touched on a little bit this idea of finding diverse partners and collaborators. So, as an organization, are there maybe some nonprofit community members that you can engage with and partner with that will bring a different perspective to the innovations that you want to be engaging in your organization, product, process, business model, and how can that be a mutually beneficial collaboration? So I mentioned a report that came out recently. Probably one of the most well-known companies with respect to design thinking is the design thinking consulting agency IDEO. And they have an open source innovation platform called Open IDEO, something I'd encourage you to check out. And they, on a routine basis, will issue sponsor-generated challenges for social innovation. And so what they did in April is they issued a challenge which was called the COVID-19 Business Pivot Challenge, basically asking the global community, what are some, or how might we take this COVID-19 situation and turn it into an opportunity? And it got responses from over 700 business and community leaders from all over the world. And one of the interesting insights related to this from the final report is they found that it's important to renew your existing partnerships, but also, again, to look for cross-sector partnerships and collaborations. And then I guess the final thing I wanted to touch on, and of course we can go in a number of different directions with our discussion, is this idea of treating life as an experiment. And this is actually a phrase coined by one of the executives from IDEO Consulting. And it's this idea, from a business perspective, I think our planning cycles have to be shorter. It doesn't mean we stop thinking about our vision. I think more than ever, it's also about understanding the big why, or the purpose, the driving purpose within your organization, because we do need some things that are stable and that undergird us with, some sense of grounding. But if you know what that is, then strategy, I think, has to move to shorter time horizons and planning cycles. And within that, maybe embracing this idea of prototyping things a little bit more. So let's do a low risk test of this idea in the form of a prototype. And I think on a personal level as well, both from the standpoint of gaining new experience that then I can bring into my ability to be a creative collaborator, but also just to stretch my own resilience. What are we doing in our lives that push us out of our current comfort zone just a little bit? And maybe that's taking a course or getting into a program at Royal Roads, but all of those things can enhance our creative capacity. Ross, did you want to say anything on that?
I just wanted to add, about this diverse partners and collaborators piece, it actually relates to a core concept that Rita emphasizes in the entrepreneurship course, this notion of the kind of the crazy quilt. There's this view that we go it alone, right? There's that kind of lone man or lone woman piece. We often raise individual leaders up on a platform, and we, to our disadvantage, by not recognizing that strength comes in diversity of perspectives and viewpoints and competencies and skill sets. And as we were mentioning earlier, the things that we are now facing, these big wicked problems, are bigger than anything that we can do alone. And so this diverse partners and collaborators piece, I think, is going to become increasingly important, but it's also, it could be challenging, managing multiple relationships that may not be well formed yet. So how open we are to reaching out across the aisle and actually starting to develop relationships and partnerships with individuals or firms that previously maybe saw as a competitor, or somebody who had nothing to offer. That's where the strengths may lie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to touch on one of my favorite things to bring into the classroom or to have students think about is, I guess I'm trying to evoke that a little bit with this picture of the kids in their superhero capes. I think even just getting back to curiosity, which is an innate childlike way of looking at the world. So staying curious, and kids are also hopeful, and they're comfortable with trying things, and they experience some bumps and bruises along the way. But just that very open-minded mindset, I think, is something that we can all take something from in this day and age.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I was just speaking with a business executive yesterday, and talking about the attributes in light of COVID, post-COVID, or what this has revealed, and the hunger that quote-unquote employers have for employees that demonstrate a spirit of curiosity, that ask good questions, that are open-minded, that are always looking for a better way. That is what they are hugely desiring, and sometimes not always finding that they have enough of. So that's another way that all of us could differentiate ourselves and create more value, is demonstrating a spirit of curiosity.
Absolutely. And so I guess as a transition to our conversation or any questions that you might have, I just wanted to leave you with this idea to hopefully inspire you to want to grab your own cape. And then if you want to know more, I mean, there's all kinds of resources. I could have had a much longer list than is on the screen here, but I think these are some of the more timely resources that you might want to consider. Yeah, and Alana is saying, would having interdisciplinary teams be a good way to support design thinking? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, interdisciplinary teams characterize design thinking teams. There's also quite a bit in the literature that talks about cognitive diversity, and sometimes that comes from what we might call observable diversity markers, but it's also just related to different life experiences. So interdisciplinary, all kinds of diversity in different dimensions is really supportive of creativity.
So let's open it up to comments and questions from those of you that are joining us this afternoon. This may have evoked some additional curiosity that you want to know more of, anything that we've touched on that you want to circle back to, anything that this is striked in terms of a question or a comment that you want to share. This would be a great opportunity to do that. We have a few minutes. What would you say in the meantime, Tabea, is the greatest misunderstanding that people might have when they hear the term design thinking, or if they've had some limited exposure to it?
Well, first of all, the term is very ambiguous. So it's got this design piece, the thinking piece. So people will very often go to what their most immediate association is. and we're struggling with that in the literature to find an agreed upon conception of design thinking. The biggest misconception, I guess, that concerns me is the notion that it is this linear process. So if I go through empathize, define, ideate, and so on, and I kind of follow that, but I'm using still a linear approach, then it's really missing the power that is inherent in the design thinking approach.
Some questions coming in. So Trevor asks, is design theory important for a startup? So how does this connect to the world of kind of classic entrepreneurship?
Oh gosh, there's a lot in that question. Well, design, I think presumes an idea that you're starting with something that doesn't exist yet, right? And that is entrepreneurship. So you've got some raw material, and if you think about it too, everything that we see in the world around us was designed by someone, and it was designed to meet a need. So I think there's, immediate correlations and obvious correlations there with entrepreneurship, which is, if I'm going to start a business, provide a new service or product, it's because there was a gap in the market and a need for that product or service, or there was a deficiency in what was there. So it is the notion that you're starting from nothing and creating something that's useful and has value.
I think that whole empathy piece, truly understanding what the needs, concerns, or expectations of a particular audience or constituency is, that has to be part of the entrepreneurial journey as well. And so, Trevor, I think design thinking, design theory applies as much to insiders inside of organizations, whether they're pursuing entrepreneurial types of activities or kind of the classic external entrepreneur. I think it adds value to both, and we view it within the context of the BCom as an important part of the skill set or the toolbox that an entrepreneurially minded and action-oriented person needs to have. Yeah, sorry.
And sorry, I was just going to say too, without taking time to unpack the various models too, there's a lot in design thinking that kind of maps onto agile development as well as the lean startup methodology. Exactly. If you're familiar with those.
Jane asks, where do you go when there's a failure in a prototype? Do you go back to the beginning, or what do you do when you face resistance or a realization that the prototype you come up with is not meeting the needs or expectations of the constituent you designed it for?
Yeah, so I would say if you prototype something and you test it and it fails, that's a win. Because the whole idea of prototyping, and when we do this in the classroom, and this is modeled after what organizations do, let's say the student, part of their prototype involves an app or a website. The students will actually draw just 2 layers of that application. So the home page, and then wherever various clicks will take them, and no further than that, because inevitably once they take that to an end user and ask for feedback, they'll get insights about assumptions that they made that were wrong. But the beauty of those low fidelity prototypes early in the process and doing that in cycles is that you're using paper, right? So you're testing the desirability of the idea before you have to think about the feasibility of the idea. And a lot of, traditional product or service development had this blueprint model instead of a prototyping model. So we'll conceive of it, we'll do our market research, and now we know to build it out. And then, you get a product on the shelves, people take it home and use it, and that's when you find out all the things about it that are broken. So fail early, fail fast.
Daryl mentions that design thinking was a process that started in the field of architecture in the 90s and up to today. And it's interesting, Daryl, one of the core faculty members in the school who specializes in design thinking, actually has a degree in architecture. And so we talk a lot about studio space and what happens in the journey of becoming an architect and how that relates to how we're now incorporating a design thinking as a tool and approach in the context of business and management. So thank you for that and the reference to a firm out of Seattle. Bill's asking whether or not you have any favorite tools or approaches that you like to use related to design thinking?
Yeah, so I think if you just do a quick Google search and on design thinking tools, you'll find a lot. There are a lot of tools, and I think those of us who are practitioners kind of have favorites. I had on the screen earlier something called the journey map, and so that really is kind of scripting one persona's experience with your product or service. That's very illustrative. So that's a tool. There's something called the empathy map. So it gives you a little bit of structure in your examination of, what are the pain points for customers, what specific needs do they have in a lot of different variables. There's all kinds of, I should say, especially in light of all of us working from home, there are so many good design thinking collaborative online platforms now, and online versions of tools that traditionally have only been, you were only able to use them physically. So there's all kinds of stuff out there. And I think all of us have different
Emma and Mike are
tools.
asking questions that are somewhat related, and that is, given the pressing nature of some of the issues we're facing right now and the desire for more immediate responses or results, is this a time for design thinking? Does it work well when you're looking for immediate or highly responsive solutions, or is it something that requires a slower burn and it's more of a luxury?
I think it's adaptable. So, let's say I was working on some kind of organizational change strategy. That is something you're not going to be able to do in a 2 or 3 day sprint. You're not going to be able to do it well. However, if you're a small organization, you can do these little mini design sprints, if you will. And even if you just take that prototyping piece, so we've got this idea of something that might work. How can we turn this into an experiment, a small experiment? So what would be the paper or the low fidelity prototype, just to give us some early insight? You really can go through that prototyping cycle very, very quickly, and it's so instructive.
Also, a question being asked around, Trevor's asking, how many of the faculty are actually got some entrepreneurial experience? Depending on how you define kind of an entrepreneur, Trevor, everybody that teaches in the BCom has applied experience in the field that they are teaching on. Vast majority of them are actually still active practitioners. So some of them have started and own and manage businesses, or they have the executive experience and are bringing kind of an entrepreneurial approach to that practice area as well. Julia, we're going to be offering the next webinar in this series. We're offering other webinars across the university. But the next webinar in our series on navigating uncertainty is on the changing landscape of work. So Michael Party, another faculty member within that I work with in the BCom, and I will be talking about not only the things that were starting to happen before COVID, but maybe what COVID is going to be accelerating or is revealed about the changing landscape of work. So we're going to be looking at a bit of the future of work conversation next month. So I know we're up against the top of the hour, and I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon and making the time and hearing us out. Thank you so much, Tabea, for all that you have brought, all the perspective and applied wisdom that you're bringing to this. And I'm hoping all of you are leaving with something more than you came with. So this was a good use of your time. For those who are interested in more of what we do at Royal Roads, we have a next intake of our Bachelor of Commerce program in Entrepreneurial Management that I oversee, and Tabea teaches in. Our next intake is in August. We also have a Bachelor of Business Administration in Business and Sustainability, which is an on-campus program, and then a whole raft of graduate programs that may be of interest to you. So I encourage you to reach out to an enrollment advisor or click on any of these links or visit the Royal Roads website for more information. So thank you again. Appreciate your time and your attention this afternoon, and all the best for the rest of your day. Thank you.